Thank you for joining us for this episode of Talking Health in the 406, where we are one community under the big sky. I'm your host, Maureen Ward, and I work to promote safe and healthy lifestyle choices to help Montanans avoid common life-changing injuries. Today, we'll be talking about sudden cardiac arrest with our guest, Janet Trethewey. Janet has worked on and off as a first responder for 40 years and currently focuses on improving survival rates for time-sensitive illnesses. Sudden cardiac arrest can happen to anyone, and Janet is going to help shed some light on how communities can be better prepared for these incidents when they occur. Thanks for joining us today, Janet. I'd like to start with, what is sudden cardiac arrest? Is that the same thing as having a heart attack? Can you explain that?
Sudden cardiac arrest is when the heart stops beating versus a heart attack where a portion of the heart isn't getting a blood supply, and so it's starting to die. A heart attack can lead to sudden cardiac arrest. If enough of the heart muscle dies, obviously it's going to stop beating. But sudden cardiac arrest itself is typically an electrical problem. The heart isn't getting signal to cause it to contract, where a heart attack is a plumbing problem. There's usually a blockage in an artery that's causing a part of the heart muscle to die. One can lead to the other, but a sudden cardiac arrest, I love this quote from a physician that sudden cardiac arrest is the most critical medical condition you can have.
When I think about heart problems, if I hear sudden cardiac arrest, I might not differentiate that from heart attack without hearing what you just said. Mostly this is maybe an older person problem, but then it seems like we've seen more and more in the news recently of some of these younger athletic people that have had sudden cardiac arrests, like Bronny James, and some local stories here from Montana. Can you just talk to us a little bit about who is at risk and what community should be looking for?
Typically, and yes, most people who have a sudden cardiac arrest are older. They have developed issues with their heart where part of the heart muscle has died or part of the heart muscle isn't getting a good blood supply. And those nerves that are sending signals are not working properly. And so they do have a cardiac arrest. But it isn't an old person's condition because there are lots of causes of cardiac arrest. People can have a congenital condition or a condition they were born with, that there's a problem with the wiring in their heart. About 4 years ago, we had a young man down in Townsend who was 16 years old. He's playing basketball. He was in practice. They were doing conditioning at the end of practice, and he collapsed from a sudden cardiac arrest. And luckily, coaches knew what to do. The EMS responders knew what to do and were there very quickly. And he had a very, very good outcome. He was actually defibrillated with an AED on the gym floor. And by the time the ambulance got there, he was awake. And when they did a bunch of tests, they came to find out that he had a problem with the wiring in his heart that he was born with. And so that we see quite often. Bronny James, obviously LeBron James' son, he had the same kind of a condition. It's same kind in that it's an electrical activity problem. There's about 5 of them. So, I'm not sure which one, but again, the thing we find with these young athletes that have these sudden cardiac arrests is exercise is actually the trigger of the cardiac arrest. Obviously, we want people to be physically active and we want people to exercise. It's just that these things happen where all of a sudden their heart decides that it's not going to fire properly that day. And so that's typically what we see with kids is these heart conditions that they're born with that nobody knows about until something happens. Fortunately, they are very reversible in almost all cases if there is everything in place that will make sure that they can be resuscitated. The classic one everybody talks about too is Damar Hamlin. And Damar Hamlin actually had a really, really rare event happen where if the heart is in exactly the right phase of the heartbeat and they take a blow exactly in the right spot in the chest, it causes the heart to stop. And it's a fluke that those happen. It is just, don't go buy a lottery ticket that day because it was one of those things that just happens. But again, it's really reversible if all the pieces are in place. And like the young man in Townsend and like Damar Hamlin and Bronny James, they were very fortunate that they were in a school or in a facility that had trained people that recognized that cardiac arrest right away. They had an AED really close that they were able to get on to that patient real quickly. They followed the directions. That's the big thing, is that when it says to shock that patient, you need to shock that patient, because what happens is the electrical activity needs to be reset. And that's what the AED does, is resets the electrical activity. And so they need to be shocked. They need that CPR. And then obviously somebody's got to call 911 and get ambulance and fire and everybody else that's going to respond, get him coming. And so in all of those cases, they had all of those pieces in place. They had that plan in place, and they had practiced that plan. That's the other thing. I'm a real big, strong proponent that just like schools have fire drills and just like schools have active shooter drills, they need to have CPR drills where the janitor or the lunch lady or one of the students has a cardiac arrest, and how do they respond to that? And it just doesn't happen without that practice, because people are excited, they're rattled, there's this, person is not breathing, they're not. And so it's important to have those drills just like they do for fire and all of that. I got a report recently from Billings. They had a guy go down. He had a cardiac arrest at work. They had AEDs in place. They had a plan. They had practiced the plan. They got to him right away. They shocked him. They did CPR. The ambulance got there. He had a heartbeat by the time the ambulance got there. They took him to the hospital, and 2 days later, he's in cardiac rehab. So it's not just schools. It's, everybody where people gather need to have an AED. They need to know how to do CPR. They need to practice that plan. They need to do drills, just like they do drills for evacuation for any other kind of an emergency. And so I think that that's hugely important, that people, it's not enough to just hang an AED on the wall. It's not enough to know how to call 911. We need those other pieces in place, and we can have some really good outcomes when we have those things ready to go.
So with schools or businesses that are looking to create this as part of their emergency response plan, what sort of tools or resources are out there? I mean, I think it's easy to say, just create a plan and practice a plan. But if this is completely new to an organization, and maybe they do have the AED hanging up on the wall, and they've got a few people who have first aid and CPR and AED training, but that's about as far as they've gone, what do you recommend? Like, where do they start?
They start with my office. Short answer, get a hold of me. I have plans that I can send them templates, and the templates then walk them through. They can Google an AED emergency plan or a cardiac arrest emergency plan. The American Heart Association has the template. The American College of Cardiology has a template. OSHA has a template. There's tons of them out there that you can just Google an emergency action plan for cardiac arrest. The nice thing is, and this is the thing I tell schools again too, is that if you have an emergency action plan for a cardiac arrest, and a cardiac arrest is the most serious medical condition you have, everything else falls into that plan. And no matter what, if it's severe bleeding or it's a head injury or whatever else, the plan works for all those other things just as well. You take care of what's going on. You call 911. And, if you've practiced for a cardiac arrest and something else happens, you know exactly what to do. And so it's not just this isolated one little thing. It actually covers a lot of emergencies that happen. And so having that emergency action plan and practicing it covers you for lots of other things as well. And like I said, you can Google them anywhere, or you can reach out to my office and I can get you a template as well.
Great. What are some of the frequently asked questions that you get in your office about sudden cardiac arrest and how to respond to these emergencies?
Most of the questions that I get are related to where do I find a CPR class and how do I register my AED? The CPR class portion is kind of tricky in that it depends on what your needs are. If you're in a school with kids, young kids, you need to do a CPR class that covers rescue breathing and choking and all of that, because kids are not just miniature adults and you have to do different things for them. If you're working in a setting where you have mostly adults, taking a hands-only CPR class is all you need to do. You don't need to provide rescue breathing for an adult. So it's a much simpler process, actually. I tell people, check with their local fire department, check with their local ambulance service, check with their local hospital. Those are good places to start to be able to take a CPR class. If it's a hands-only course that doesn't require an instructor per se, because the video does the teaching for you. And several years ago, it's been almost 10 years ago now, I, through a grant, was able to purchase a bunch of mannequins and the videos, and I put them in totes and I distributed them around the state, typically through EMS agencies, but sometimes through a fire department or something like that. And I handed out all these totes so that people could use the totes and teach CPR, hands-only CPR in the senior center or to their family or whatever. But it seems that in a lot of communities, they've migrated to school, which is great. And then they're teaching hands-only CPR in the schools. But look for those. You can do an online hands-only CPR class through the American Heart Association. Go to cpr-heart.org and you can get the video and watch it. But like I said, if you're working with young kids or if there's a certificate requirement based on policy or whatever, then you need to reach out to someone that's teaching a class. The other question I get a lot is about AEDs. And in Montana, we have a statute that says an AED must be registered with the state of Montana. And that is through my office. And what the registration does is twofold. One is that part of the registration process is getting the people that are going to respond to that emergency aware that there is an AED on site. In a perfect world, if someone were to call 911 and say, we have someone having a cardiac arrest, the dispatcher would, number one, be able to pull up on their CAD system a map that says, you have an AED in that facility, or next door is an AED. The other thing that they would be able to do is provide CPR instructions over the phone until help arrives. That doesn't always happen in Montana, but that's the goal and that's the ideal. The way that those AEDs show up on that map is when they register the AED with the state, they notify the dispatch center that they have that AED. The registration process also requires that they have that plan and that they have people who know CPR and how to use the AED. That doesn't preclude anybody from using an AED. AEDs are simple. You turn them on and they talk you through everything you need to do, step by step by step. But it is ideal to have at least a few people in a facility that know CPR and know how to use that AED and are trained to use it. It's like in the shopping mall. Yeah, there's probably 3 or 4 people that know how to use that AED that have been trained. But anybody walking down the mall can pull it off the wall and use it and be successful with it because it walks you through it. The other thing that registration process does then is it provides liability coverage for the people that do the training and own the AED. The Good Samaritan law that Montana has covers if you use an AED or you do CPR on someone, the Good Samaritan law is going to cover you. But owning the AED or doing the training for those AEDs, it just provides another level of coverage for you. I'm not aware of anyone who has successfully sued someone for having an AED. It's more the opposite when you don't have an AED and the expectation is that you would. That's when people find themselves being questioned. The other piece that's really important is if you have an AED, you have to check it every month to make sure that the batteries are good and the pads are good. The pads have a gel in them that conducts the electricity, and over time they dry out. And so it's important that you check those pads periodically to make sure that they haven't gotten damaged and dried out. And then eventually they do have to be replaced. And the same with the batteries. The batteries eventually are going to die and you need to replace those. And so having as part of your plan, somebody that's responsible for checking those AEDs and making sure that they're in good working order is also really important. Those are the big questions I get.
Great. So for businesses or organizations that maybe don't have an AED yet, but they're looking into it, how do they get one? About how much do they cost? Are there any resources to assist them in getting one at a cheaper cost?
AEDs can start out at a little under $1,000 for one, and then they go up from there, just like any other piece of equipment. The big things I always tell people when they say, well, what AED should I buy? I say, buy the best one you can afford. And the brand really doesn't matter. Every brand has different features. And that's the thing that, what works for you. What you want to do is look at what can you afford and getting the best one that you can buy for what you can afford. Beyond that, businesses a lot of times can get either assistance with purchasing an AED or get rebates for purchasing an AED or things like that through their insurance companies. Especially businesses that, like health clubs and all of that, they need to have an AED. And typically their insurance agency or their insurance plan will either give them a break or give them a rebate or something to help them purchase those. Not-for-profit entities, there's lots of different grants available. Schools, churches, senior centers, libraries, things like that. They qualify for lots of different grant opportunities out there. And so you just have to look and see what might be fit their organization. One of the things I tell people is go to your animal groups, your eagles, your elks, your moose, your lions, the koalas. And if everybody donates a couple $100, pretty quick, you've got an AED that the community has helped support through those agencies. That's always a really good option for communities. Hospitals sometimes have a foundation that offer grants for AEDs as well. So getting an AED is really not as difficult as people think in terms of coming up with the funding. The big thing is the sustainability. Again, like I said, you have to plan into your budget every couple of years. You've got to replace those pads and replace those batteries. And so anticipating that ongoing cost every couple of years is really important as well. As far as where to get one, you can go on a line and there are as many vendors as there are AEDs. There's AED Plus and I don't know, all of the different companies that offer AEDs. And you just Google and then do some comparison shopping and see who's got the best bang for your buck. Once you get that AED, then you can reach out to my office and get it registered. We changed the rule several years ago, and now the state medical director is the medical supervision for the AEDs across the state. So you don't have to have a medical supervisor for your AEDs. The reason for that is that when the statute was originally developed, AEDs were really new and everybody was really nervous about them. And now we have 20 years of history that people realize, yeah, this is not something that's scary. I mean, it is scary, but it's something that medical supervision is a lot more to review cases if somebody has a question or to answer questions if somebody asks them. But it's not like you have to look at every case and make sure that everybody did everything perfectly, because that's not the point.
Okay, great. So do you have any tips for untrained bystanders out there? If someone, you hear about the bystander effect where there's an emergency in a public place and someone always assumes someone else is going to have more training or is going to be more qualified to help that person. And sometimes they just lay there without assistance. What would you do to encourage bystanders to help out? What sorts of things can they look for? Is there a way to tell that it's sudden cardiac arrest versus another medical emergency just by, looking at them or doing some basic assessment? Or is it just really important to get 911 on the phone and have them help you?
Being unconscious is a medical emergency. Doesn't matter why you're unconscious. It's not normal. And so being unconscious is a medical emergency. Call 911. When you look at someone who's having a sudden cardiac arrest, especially with older people, for a short period of time, they may do some funny kind of breathing. It's like fish out of water, gasping kind of breathing. And so the question is, are they conscious? Are they breathing like you and I are? If they're not, start CPR. If they don't need CPR and they wake up saying, stop pushing on my chest, score. That's exactly what you want. But if they don't, then you know that you needed to do CPR. Young kids sometimes will actually have almost like seizure activity. But again, they're unconscious. They're not breathing normally. Start CPR. If they're having a seizure and they wake up, great. But if they're not, you don't want to delay that CPR trying to figure out what's going on. The coaches talk about that with the young man down in Townsend, that when he first collapsed, he was doing this gasping, funny kind of breathing. They thought he was having an asthma attack. And so the first thing they did is they ran and got an inhaler and tried to have him use an inhaler. And that delayed starting CPR probably by a minute. And so again, he wasn't breathing normally. He was kind of having some seizure activity. And it wasn't until that seizure activity stopped that the coaches went, oh, this isn't a seizure. And then they started CPR. So it delayed care about a minute. And that's the thing that we want to try to avoid. And so by making sure that as soon as you recognize that they're not breathing normally and they're unconscious, you start CPR and you assume it's a cardiac arrest until otherwise proven. I have a friend who is an ER nurse, and he and his family were out camping and he was goofing around and he fell and he got the wind knocked out of him and had kind of dazed him. And he woke up to his sister doing CPR on him. And he kind of laughed because, first of all, he didn't think she liked him that much. And then she cracked a rib. But he was like, I was fine with that because she did what she was supposed to do. She started CPR until it was ruled out that he was fine. So those are the kinds of things that we really want to be aware of, is that it's just they're not breathing normally and they're unconscious. If you come upon someone, unfortunately in Montana, because again, most people who have a cardiac arrest are older people, they're unwitnessed. Nobody was around when they had it, so we don't know how long they've been out. And so looking at those people, we want to make sure that you get them on their back. And then if they're not breathing and they're turning blue or turning gray, we start CPR. again, we don't know how long they've been down. And unfortunately, that's when things don't have really good outcomes, is when they've been unwitnessed arrests, because, the brain has gone too long without oxygen. But if they're a witnessed arrest, they have a really good chance of surviving because people are right there to do something about it. The other question you asked is, what do we do? People in a crowd are kind of afraid to step up. We talk about people not being bystanders. Bystanders stand around and watch. Trystanders or responders are people that act. And don't be afraid to act. Yeah, it's scary. It's a very stressful event. I have been twice now in positions where I'm just somebody in a restaurant and someone has collapsed. And both times I stepped up. The one time I did CPR and the gentleman survived. The other time it wasn't a cardiac arrest event. It was a diabetic event, but I didn't know that until EMS got there. But you just kind of have to say, I'm going to take care of this situation. And first thing you do is say, point to a person and say, call 911. And then that's the other thing, is that hopefully your dispatcher is going to help you with whatever you need to do. They're going to talk you through what needs to be done to help with that situation. So that's real important, and just not being afraid to do it, not being afraid to step forward and be that tri-stander or be that responder. Otherwise, they're not going to have a good outcome. We don't want to wait. And the reality is, for the most part, the people that you would ever do CPR on are people you know. They're your family, they're your coworkers, things like that. And so I think it's less daunting. It's not a stranger. We see some amazing videos of people walking down the concourse at an airport that collapse, and, true strangers start CPR. But those are very, very unlikely. You're going to know this person for whatever reason. So that motivates you to want to help a little bit more too. The other piece of that is to remember, I was just visiting with a lady that her husband had a sudden cardiac arrest, and she did CPR, and he did not survive. And she felt really, really bad. She had a lot of survivor guilt for about a year. And finally, she went back to the physician who was in the emergency room when they took her husband in, and he pulled up his records. And there was a note in the record that said that based on everything, there was nothing anybody could do. And that finally made her feel better, that she had done everything right, but it wasn't going to be a good outcome. And so I think that's the other thing that people need to remember, is that you're giving them a really, really, really good shot. But the reality is that survival rates, kids are about 85% of kids who have a sudden cardiac arrest will survive if it's witnessed. Adults, if it's witnessed, it's still less than 50% of them that survive. But there is that chance. And so that's why we want to start. For people to never feel bad that they could have done something better or something different. They did something. And that's the other thing, is that we watch videos. There's a case of a guy at a health club who collapsed from a sudden cardiac arrest. And the people that were there was an AED there that they brought it. They never put it on the guy. The person that was doing CPR, you could tell, was really nervous, and it was really bad CPR, and the guy still survived and had a really good outcome. So what we know is even bad CPR is better than no CPR. So don't be afraid. A certificate has never saved anybody. Somebody stepping up and doing CPR is what saves people. And even if it's not textbook perfect, is better than nothing. I think that's the take-home message, is sudden cardiac arrest is a fatal event unless we intervene. And when we intervene, we give them an opportunity to survive, but it's still not a guarantee.
Yeah, that really is key, is that, if the heart isn't doing anything, right, you got to give it at least a chance.
Yeah.
Going back to AEDs, I think, that's such a great tool that we have available to us now. Is there anything in the data that tells us that these are working? Like having these out in our communities is improving survival rates for witnessed sudden cardiac arrests? And what does that look like?
It's really interesting. There's a program called CARES, which tracks cardiac arrest survival. And we haven't done this in Montana, but I was just at a meeting where they actually took the city of Chicago and they used 10 years worth of data and they mapped where the cardiac arrest events were happening. And they looked at tri-standard CPR and they looked at AED use. And they found gaps, these big areas within the city where there was nobody doing CPR and there were no AEDs. And so they went out and they started teaching people CPR and they started putting AEDs in public places. And you can just see those spots starting to light up over that 10-year period as those AEDs were starting to be used and the CPR was starting to be done and the survival rates improved. They went from 0 to about 15, 20%. And that's for all comers. So that includes all of the unwitnessed arrests as well. But yeah, you can track that with mapping, using that data. And so we know that those AEDs are making a difference. We know that teaching people CPR makes a difference. We know that having dispatchers who can coach somebody through CPR over the phone makes a difference. And so, anything communities can do to improve those links in the chain of survival is really going to make a difference. It is going to improve survival.
Are there any myths you hear about sudden cardiac arrest? And if there are, what do you say to address those?
I don't know that it's really a myth, but if you watch a lot of television and you watch a lot of doctor shows and EMS shows, like Chicago Fire and Chicago Med. And
personally, for me, it's Grey's Anatomy and Guilty as Charged.
Mm-hmm. They actually did a study, and in those types of television shows, upwards of 80% of the people who have CPR done on them survive, which is completely flip of the outcomes in real life. It's only about 15% of the people that do survive for all comers. And so there's this expectation that CPR is always going to work. And that's not the reality. TV sets us up for failure in so many ways. And that's one of them, is that when you watch those shows and people survive at a much higher rate than in real life. And so that's really unfortunate, is that we create that expectation. The other big myth is that you're always going to break ribs. That's not true. Looking at the anatomy, ribs are attached to the sternum by cartilage. And so when you start doing CPR, it's just like popping your knuckles. You actually start separating those ribs from the cartilage. They're not broken. They're what we call separated. If you've ever had a wrestler in your house, they've had separated ribs, because that's just really, really common. When people's ribs break, because the rib is like a U shape, they actually break under the armpits. As you squish them down, that's where they break, along the armpits. But as you do CPR, that popping sensation you feel is just the ribs separating from the cartilage. They're not broken. And, I know lots of people that wake up that are really, really sore, but they are really, really happy to be alive. And so don't stop just because you think you've broken ribs. Make sure your hands are right over the sternum and just keep right on going.
And with that, is there anything else that we haven't talked about that you want to make sure our listeners know about sudden cardiac arrest and what they can do in their communities?
Heart Rescue Foundation is a national program that we partner with, and it helps communities using documentation to improve survival from cardiac arrest. And the way they do it is they look at, how many people get trained in CPR, where are your AEDs, what kind of training does your ambulance service have, all of those things. And it's a step-by-step process that you can go through. And when you're done, you can go through this whole process. You can submit your project to Heart Rescue, and they will actually go through the documentation and everything, and then you can become a Heart Safe community. And so the Heart Safe Community project is really a cool thing. They actually will help. They'll set up Zoom calls with the coordinators to help give them ideas and encouragement and things like that. And it's a really, really cool program that helps communities improve their outcomes from sudden cardiac arrest. We have had one community in the state of Montana that's done that. Glasgow has gone through the process and was awarded a Heart Safe Communities award. And so it's kind of cool to know that this little tiny town up in Northeast Montana was able to pull it together and do that. Lots of communities in Montana have parts and pieces of it. They just haven't gone through the formal process of pulling it all together and having that for their community. But they've done pieces and parts of it. I think that's, if people are interested in that, they can reach out to me and I can get them connected with the Heart Safe Communities project. Another cool thing that we have here in Montana that anybody can use and anybody can do, it's called Pulse Point AED. And it's an app that you download on your phone. It's a yellow background. It looks like a little yellow heart. And if you are in a situation then where you need an AED, you pull up the app and it will show you all of the AEDs within a 1/4-mile radius of where you are. You can also, my husband laughs at me because I do this all the time. We're on vacation and we're wandering around and I see an AED and I pull out my phone and you take a picture of the AED with the app and it geolocates that AED on the app. It's a crowdsourcing way to add locations of AEDs through this Pulse Point AED app. And so it's a nice way for people to be able to find an AED in their communities. And it's also a way to add more AEDs to the app. We use it as part of our registration process. When you register your AED, we ask that you go on to the Pulse Point AED app and pin your AEDs. And then that way you can also add things like this is in a business that's open from 8 until 5. And so in the evenings, the AED isn't available because you can't get into the business. Or if it's a mobile AED, like the railroad and lots of construction companies, they have AEDs in their vehicles. And so it's mobile. And so it doesn't get pinned on the map. It's just, we know that they have them in their vehicles. Really cool. The city of Bozeman has been very, very proactive with their AED program. And all of the city vehicles, not just law enforcement vehicles, but the water truck guys, the park and rec guys, everybody has an AED on their vehicle in the city of Bozeman. So anytime you're in Bozeman and you see a city vehicle, you know that there's an AED on that vehicle. And that's a really neat service that the community provides. But that Pulse Point AED app helps you locate those AEDs. And all you do is go to your app store, Pulse Point AED. Like I said, it's a really cool app that people can use. I've had communities where the 4-H kids or the Boy Scouts, they do it as a scavenger hunt. And they'll run around and take pictures of all the AEDs in their community and geolocate them all, make it kind of a contest to see who can get the most AEDs. It's a really neat feature, especially if you're traveling. It'll tell you where the AED is in the hotel you're staying in, things like that, because we never know when an emergency is going to happen.
Thanks for listening to Talking Health in the 406, where we are one community under the big sky. I'm your host, Maureen Ward. Our guest today was Janet Trethewey, the Time-Sensitive Illness and Injury Program Manager at Montana DPHHS and member of the first responder community for over 4 decades. If you'd like more information on what we discussed today, you can head on over to talkinghealthin the406.mt.gov. Don't forget to rate, review, and subscribe. And until next time, take care and stay healthy.